A ladder that's always in the same spot. Gone. 2 trucks that started fine the day before. Dead. A barrel of water George Sodder kept just for emergencies. Frozen solid. On the morning of December 25th, 1945, in Fayetteville, West Virginia, every single backup plan a father had for a house fire failed, one after another, in the space of about 10 minutes. 5 of his children vanished that night. Not died, friends. Vanished. No bones, no teeth, no bracelet, no coin, nothing recovered from that fire, even though the fire chief himself later went looking. So I want you to sit with that for a second. How do you lose 5 children to a house fire and find nothing at all? Hello, friends. Today we're going back to that freezing Christmas Eve to walk through exactly what happened in the Sodder house, hour by hour, and why a case that should have ended 80 years ago still hasn't. George Sodder was born Giorgio Soddu in Sardinia, Italy in 1895 and came to the United States in 1908 at just 13 years old, traveling with an older brother who turned around and went home almost immediately. George never fully explained why he himself never went back. By the 1940s, he'd built a trucking company in Fayetteville, hauling coal and dirt, and he and his wife, Jenny, had 10 children. They were, in the words of one local official at the time, one of the most respected families in town. George also had a habit that mattered more than anyone realized. He openly criticized Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, only months after Mussolini had been killed by his own partisans. Some of George's fellow Italian immigrants in town did not appreciate that, and George was never the type to keep quiet about it just to keep the peace. On the afternoon of December 24th, 1945, the family's oldest daughter, 17-year-old Marion, came home from her job at a dime store with toys for her younger siblings. 3 of them, 12-year-old Martha, 8-year-old Jenny, and 5-year-old Betty, begged to stay up late and play. Their mother said yes on one condition. 14-year-old Maurice and his 9-year-old brother Louis had to feed the cows and lock up the chickens first. By around 10:30 p.m., Jenny took the youngest, 3-year-old Sylvia, up to bed. George, 23-year-old John, and 16-year-old George Jr. were already asleep, worn out from a full day of work. One Sodder son, 21-year-old Joe, wasn't home at all. He'd been discharged from the army just the day before and was still making his way back. Here's the first odd detail, friends. File it away because we're coming back to it. At around 12:30 a.m., the phone rang. Jenny answered. A woman's voice asked for a name she didn't recognize, laughed strangely, and the line went dead. When Jenny checked the house afterward, the curtains were open and the lights were on, chores the children always finished before bed, and hadn't this time. Jenny went back to sleep. A little while later, she heard something hit the roof, like a rubber ball, she'd later say, and roll off the side of the house. She still didn't get up. Keep that one in mind too, friends. About 30 minutes after that thump, Jenny woke up again, this time to smoke pouring into the bedroom. She ran for the room that held the only working phone in the house. It was already engulfed. George woke the rest of the house, and within minutes, he, Jenny, Marion, John, and George Jr. were outside. 5 children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were still upstairs. George ran for his ladder, the one he kept against the side of the house every single day without exception. It wasn't there. He ran for his 2 coal trucks instead, planning to climb onto one and reach the upstairs windows. Both had worked perfectly the day before. Neither would start. He grabbed a bucket and ran for the rain barrel he kept full, specifically for emergencies just like this one. It was frozen solid, in a barrel that should never have frozen that hard, that fast. George tried to climb the side of the house by hand and sliced a strip of skin clean off his arm. He didn't notice until later. Marion ran to call for help and got no operator response at all. A neighbor drove into town and physically tracked down Fire Chief F.J. Morris, who then had to wake his crew one phone call at a time. because Fayetteville's fire department didn't even have a working siren. The department was 2.5 miles away. The first truck didn't arrive until 8 a.m. By then, friends, there was nothing left to save. Can you imagine standing in your front yard, watching your house burn, and having every single tool you'd normally reach for fail you, one right after another? By the time the fire died down, the 2-story house was a pile of smoking ash, and George and Jenny had to accept that 5 of their children were gone. Chief Morris's working theory was straightforward and, frankly, merciful to believe. The blaze had likely burned hot enough to fully cremate the children's remains. But here's where the official story falls apart. A search of the property that same day turned up no bones, no remains of any kind. Years later, George pushed for a far more thorough excavation, bringing in a Washington, D.C. pathologist named Oscar Hunter to personally oversee it. That dig did turn up something: 4 small fragments of bone buried in the basement dirt. They were sent to the Smithsonian institution, and the report that came back made the case stranger, not simpler. The bones were human, yes, but they belonged to one single person, between 16 and 22 years old at time of death. Maurice, the oldest missing child, was only 14. The bones showed no sign of ever being exposed to fire at all. The Smithsonian's own scientists called it very strange that a basement fire could leave behind 4 vertebrae and nothing else. Their best guess was that the bones had simply been mixed into the dirt George used to fill the basement, possibly from a nearby cemetery. Nobody ever fully explained how they actually got there. And remember that strange call at 12:30 a.m.? When investigators tracked down the woman who'd supposedly dialed the Sodder house, she said it had simply been a wrong number, fully unconnected to the family. That answer didn't sit right with Jenny either. Then came the detail that changed everything for the Sodders. Months later, once the snow melted, little Sylvia found a small, hard, dark green rubber object in the brush near where the house had stood. George remembered Jenny's account of something thumping the roof that night and recognized it instantly. It looked to him like a hardened incendiary device, the kind used in combat, sometimes called a pineapple bomb. That thump on the roof wasn't nothing. It may have been the fire's actual starting point. And there was more. A bus driver who'd passed through Fayetteville that night told the Sodders he'd seen someone throwing balls of fire at the house. A local investigator who later examined the scene more closely found that the blaze hadn't behaved like a typical electrical fire at all, despite state police initially blaming faulty wiring, a claim George disputed outright, since the house had been freshly rewired and passed inspection just weeks earlier. Here's where the smaller mysteries from earlier start circling back, friends. 2 months before the fire, a stranger had shown up at the Sodder home asking about hauling work, then walked around back, pointed at the fuse boxes and said, unprompted, "This is going to cause a fire someday." Around the same time, a life insurance salesman, furious after George turned him down, reportedly warned that George's house would go up in smoke and that his children would be destroyed. Specifically, he said, because of George's comments about Mussolini. The Sodder boys had also noticed a car parked near the house for days, with men inside watching the younger children walk home from school. So you've got a missing ladder, 2 dead trucks, a frozen barrel, vertebrae that don't belong to any of the children, a hard green object that looked like a grenade, a threat tied directly to George's politics, and 0 confirmed human remains from the children themselves. Individually, any one of these is a coincidence. Together, the Sodders came to believe they added up to something else entirely, that the fire hadn't been an accident at all. It had been arson, set to cover a kidnapping. The case went further than most house fires ever do. The West Virginia legislature held formal hearings in 1950. The FBI opened a file, treating it as a possible interstate kidnapping before dropping it after 2 years with no answers. Newspapers across the state kept the story alive for decades, and by the late 1960s, papers were still running headlines asking what had actually happened to the children, not just covering a sad accident anymore, but an open case. In 1952, the Sodders put up a billboard along Route 16 with photographs of all 5 missing children, offering a $5,000 reward, later doubled to $10,000 for information. That same year, a motel manager in Charleston named Ida Crutchfield came forward and said that, just about a week after the fire, children matching the missing kids' description had stayed overnight at her motel with 2 men and 2 women she described as of Italian extraction. Investigators were never fully able to confirm her story. In 1968, a photograph arrived in the mail showing a young man who looked remarkably like an adult version of Lewis with a cryptic note on the back. The family hired a detective to trace where it came from. He never reported back. In 1967, a woman in Houston told them Lewis had supposedly confessed his real identity to her at a bar. George traveled there himself, alongside his son-in-law, and tracked down the men she'd named. Both denied being his sons. His son-in-law said for years afterward that he believed George never fully stopped wondering if they'd lied. So, friends, after 80 years, 2 state hearings, an FBI file, private investigators, and a billboard that stood for nearly 4 decades, what's the honest answer? It's that nobody knows. The fire department believed the children died, and their remains were lost to extreme heat. The Sodder family spent the rest of their lives believing otherwise, and they were never, ever offered proof either way. George died in 1969, still searching. Jenny tended a memorial garden on the site of the house until her own death in 1989. Their youngest daughter, Sylvia, who'd been the 3-year-old asleep beside her mother that night, kept telling the story publicly until she passed away in 2021 at 79. What would you have done with that little evidence and that much love on the line? Maybe that's the real heart of this case, not which theory is correct, but how far a parent will go rather than accept "we'll never know" as the final answer. If you've got a theory about what really happened in that house on Christmas Eve, 1945, I'd genuinely like to hear it in the comments. Thank you very much.